Most of us can remember the year of the hanging chads, those punched-style ballots that helped determine the race for president in 2000. There are still several key battleground states that are too close to call in the 2020 election. Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and North Carolina are still up for grabs. As more mail-in ballots continue to come in, it could take several days to get a final decision from those state election officials. The delay in election results is eerily reminiscent to the 2000 election between then Texas Governor George W. Bush and the former Vice President Al Gore. On election night, the results were too close to call, which forced a recount in the state of Florida. After a month-long legal battle, the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, ruled to end the vote count. George W. Bush went on to win the recount, claiming the state of Florida and ultimately winning the election by a margin of 537 votes. Early this morning, President Trump spoke from the East Room in the White House to address the election where it stands now. Although the race is still too close to call, Mr. Trump falsely declared victory while claiming the election was open to fraud.
This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election. So we'll be going to the U.S. Supreme Court. We want all voting to stop.
Justin Levitt joins me now from Los Angeles. He's a professor of law at Loyola Law School. Justin, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us. So, as you know, President Trump is currently holding a slim lead in several key states. As we've heard, Mr. Trump will be requesting a ruling from the Supreme Court to prevent states from counting any additional ballots after Election Day. Number one, I want to know if this is legal. And number two, he can't really be asking for an end to the counting, because if we were to stop now, you know, Joe Biden has more electoral votes. So he's asking for a very specific end to the counting, correct?
He's asking for something that doesn't really exist. He's asking for disenfranchising military voters. He's asking for essentially cutting off a 9-inning game in the end of the first inning. And while I'm sure Tampa Bay would have loved the same thing in Game 6 of the World Series, to stop all of the playing after they scored the first run in the first inning, that's not how this works. The president is manufacturing a reality, this is not the first time, that doesn't exist.
So we know how the election in 2000 ended, with all those hanging chads in Florida. It's almost become the butt of a joke, right? How did the decision then set a precedent for what may be a legal challenge now, 20 years later?
I don't actually think we're in Bush versus Gore territory yet. I understand why people are concerned about it. It's certainly a lot of people very anxious about this election, like they were anxious about that one. We have a president claiming that the election is going to go to the Supreme Court, so naturally people think that might happen. I don't think we're anywhere close to that yet. As you pointed out, in 2000, Florida, the difference was 537 votes. That's astonishingly close. That's a razor finish. Even though the election's still, at the moment, too close to call, too close to project, we still have millions of ballots left to count in some of the states you mentioned, in Pennsylvania, and Michigan, and Wisconsin. And unless, at the end of that count, the margin is 537 votes close, I think the people are going to decide this election, not the courts. We're just waiting for the ballots to come in. When we've added them up, it's probably going to be too high a margin to erase with litigation.
Right. You make a very good point. We're still waiting for millions of ballots to be counted. So having that razor thin of a margin is unlikely, or at least there's no indication of it yet. So, you know, just going back, though, to 2000, the Supreme Court made several key rulings in the state of Florida, which eventually led to George W. Bush, taking the election. Explain, what made the decision to stop counting ballots so controversial? Because it's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, there were still, over 100,000 ballots that didn't get counted?
Well, in Florida, and this is really important to remember, the Supreme Court didn't stop a count, it stopped a recount. So there was a count of the ballots in the initial days after Election Day. We've never had an election night result that is official. We've had projections. We've got some projections now of what we guess will happen. But the official results come in 2 to 3 weeks later when local officials and state officials certify the election. That happened in Florida. And then the race was too close at that point to figure out who had won, so we had to do a recount. We had to not only take that first answer, which we haven't gotten yet, we had to then look and see whether we could come up with a second answer. In Florida in 2000, there were all kinds of different procedures being used, different standards at different times in different counties. And the Supreme Court did, yes, in a very controversial move, eventually say, we have to stop this recount process because we can't be sure it's accurate. But all of that happened well after any phase we're in now. We haven't even gotten the first count done, much less a recount. So I think we all should step back and be a little patient. We've got plenty of time to worry about whether we're going to be in a Bush versus Gore situation if the margin is 537 votes close. Let's wait for the end of the count before we even get anywhere close to that.
Right. Really quick question, being a lawyer and being a professor of law, there are some people that say, look, if this does become a legal issue, I agree with you, we're way too early to say that it will, but if it does and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, do you think Amy Coney Barrett should recuse herself because of the appearance of bias?
I'm not sure we'll ever get into a zone anywhere close to that. The fact that the count may be close doesn't mean it's going to be that close. The fact that it's, even if it is that close, doesn't mean it's going to be litigated in court. Even if it's litigated in court, I don't know that it's going to go to the Supreme Court. Remember, they get to decide which cases they want to take. And I think there are a lot of justices who think whatever the legal issue involved, they'd much rather stay out of this fight. They saw the backlash to what happened in 2000. A lot of people thought that politicized the court and it diminished the court as an institution. So even if we get to that point, and again, really, really low probability it's going to be anywhere close to that, I don't know that the court is going to want this case. They view themselves as above any individual partisan fight. They're not out playing for a partisan team. They're very conservative, they're very progressive. Individual justices have leanings, but they don't necessarily want a Republican to win or a Democrat to win. They don't want Trump or Biden to win. And I think that's going to factor into any decision that comes anywhere through the judicial system at any point about whether the Supreme Court wants to stay the heck away from all of the trouble it encountered in 2000.
It would probably be wise. All right. Well, Professor Justin Levitt, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Of course.